All right, today we're going to open up the playbook on a really powerful and kind of risky move in property law. It's called a caveat. Now, this thing can be an incredible shield for your interests, but it can also be a hidden trap if you're not careful. So let's break down the strategy.
So picture this. You've got a deal in the works for a property. Maybe you have an option to purchase, something like that, but it's not totally finalized. Then you get wind that the owner is trying to sell it out from under you to someone else. What do? How can you legally just hit the pause button on that whole sale?
Well, the answer is a caveat. And honestly, this is the best way to think about it. It's like a legal parking boot. The second you lodge a caveat on that property's title, you've essentially immobilized it. The owner can't sell it, they can't get a new mortgage on it, they can't really do anything until your claim is sorted out. It literally forces everyone to stop and listen to you.
Now, here's the thing. You can't just slap on any old caveat. It's not a one-size-fits-all tool. Your very first move, and trust me, this is a big one, is choosing the right kind of prohibition. This is what's going to define the exact power your parking boot really has.
You've basically got two main choices on the table. You can think of it as picking between a notification or a full-on veto. One just sends out a clear warning message. The other, well, it builds a solid brick wall. Which one you pick depends completely on what your legal interest in that property actually is.
Okay, so let's start with the notification clause. This is basically your public heads up to the rest of the world. It doesn't stop a sale dead in its tracks, but it forces any new buyer to respect your rights. A perfect example is something called an equitable lease, where you have a lease agreement but it isn't formally registered. With this clause, your landlord can still sell the property, but the new owner is legally forced to honor your lease. They buy the property, they buy your tenancy along with it. They can't just kick you out.
But what if you need something stronger? That's where the veto clause comes into play. And this isn't just a heads up. This is a padlock. It puts a full stop on everything. No deal gets registered without your express written consent, period. You'd use this nuclear option when your rights are completely inconsistent with a sale, like if you hold a valid option to purchase that property.
So, you've picked your clause. Great. The next step feels pretty straightforward. Just file the paperwork. But this is where the playbook gets a little sneaky, because it looks way easier than it actually is.
On the surface, look at it. It's just a three-step process. You fill out a form, you state your claim, and you file it. Seems almost too easy to freeze a multi-million-dollar asset, right? Well, that's because at this particular stage, it is that easy. And here is the absolute key to understanding this whole thing. The person at the land registry, they're an administrator, not a judge. Their job is to file the document, not to launch a full-scale investigation into whether your claim is legit. As long as the type of interest you're claiming could, in theory, be valid, they'll accept it. And that low bar is what makes the caveat so powerful, but it's also what sets the trap for what comes next.
And now we get to the countermove, because in law, for every powerful action, there's an equally powerful reaction. If you lodge a caveat without a solid reason, if you overreach, the blowback can be financially catastrophic.
Yeah, that's the kind of number that should make you sit up and pay attention. If a property owner loses a real, legitimate sale because you put an improper caveat on their title, they can sue you for every penny of profit they lost. We could be talking hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of dollars in damages. This risk is very, very real.
And this isn't some vague threat either. The law spells it out crystal clear. If you lodged that caveat wrongfully, vexatiously, or without reasonable cause, you are liable for the damage. That's the legal test, and it hangs over every single person who files one of these.
Okay, so let's say you do have a reasonable cause. You're still not totally safe. The other side's first move is almost always to try and get your caveat thrown out on a technicality, a simple mistake on the form. And this is where the fight moves from the big picture to the tiny little details.
So when it comes to these mistakes, the courts have two main tests they use to decide if it's just a minor slip-up or a fatal, game-ending flaw. You've got the more forgiving Ulrich test and the much, much stricter Ong-Che-Tong test. Knowing which one your mistake falls under is everything.
First, let's look at the Ulrich test. This is the more lenient one. Here, the court is basically asking, hey, even with the typo, did the owner get the general idea of what's being claimed? If the mistake didn't actually mislead them or cause any real prejudice, the court will probably let it go. So what does a survivable mistake look like?
Well, maybe you just wrote interest as purchaser without getting super technical about the exact type of estate. Or maybe you got the date wrong by a day, but it was obvious there was only one contract between you two. The bottom line here is pretty simple. No real harm, no foul. If the owner wasn't actually confused, your caveat is probably safe.
But then you have the Ong-Che Tong test. And this is where it gets serious. The question here is totally different. It's not about a typo. It's about whether your mistake misleads the owner about the scope of your power. If you make a claim that misrepresents how much control you have, the court will see that as a fatal error.
Let me give you a perfect, real-world example. A caveator claimed that the owner could only sell a property to one specific company, but the actual agreement had been updated to also allow sales to the owner's descendants. The court threw the caveat out. Why? Because it wasn't just a simple error. It fundamentally misrepresented the owner's rights. It made it seem like they had far fewer options than they really did, and that's a mistake the courts just won't forgive.
So let's boil this all down into your final playbook. First, choose your power wisely. Make sure the clause you pick actually matches the rights you have. Second, always remember the core tension. It's incredibly easy to file a caveat, but the risk if you get it wrong is huge. And finally, you have to sweat the details. A minor typo might be okay, but an error that misrepresents the scope of your power can destroy your entire case.
At the end of the day, a caveat is one of the sharpest tools in the entire legal system. It can be an unbelievably powerful shield to protect what's rightfully yours. But, as we've just seen, if you handle it wrong, it becomes a double-edged sword that can cut you way worse than it cuts your opponent. The real question is, knowing the risks and the rewards, how would you choose to use it?